Okay, here we are with lesson number 3 for module 1, industrialization and labor. We're also going to build in the progressive age to this lecture as well. We're still building layers of what's going on basically between 1877 and 1900. Progressive era will take us into the 20th century, but what we're doing is we're layering basically problem after problem after problem in the United States during this time period. We've already discussed the racial issues, we discussed the conflict over imperialism, how we're attempting to expand beyond our borders and dabbling in colonialism in Latin America and with Spain's old colonies. Now we're going to start to look internally again at how our economy is doing. And this is going to be a big part of this time period that we often refer to as the Gilded Age, 1877 to 1900. The process of industrialization and the impact that it has on labor is going to be very significant for the history of this time period. So let's go ahead and get started. Remember to look at your ID terms here before we begin so that you kind of know what concepts to be targeting as we go through this lecture. Now, as I mentioned, we often refer to this time period as the Gilded Age, from 1877 to 1900. And first, before we can move on, we need to understand what gilded means. And it basically means a thin layer of gold covering something less precious. When I Google searched for images that would help to describe gilded, this is what I came up with. Gold nail polish, I guess that technically qualifies. And then this image right here was just disturbing enough for me to include it. Technically, that is an example of something that is gilded. So it's when there is a false appeal. Something looks good from the outside, although that's debatable here. It looks good from the outside, but underneath there's something less valuable, there's something corrupt, there's something dark about it. And so if we apply that to this Gilded Age, what we're basically saying is that, yeah, it looks like things are going to be going pretty well in the United States, but if we scratch the surface of this supposedly booming economy due to industrialization, we're going to see that there are a lot of problems with this time period. So the industrialization process has really been going on since the beginning of the 1800s in multiple waves. We had the first wave of industrialization that's really over by 1850, and here in the Gilded Age we're in the second wave of industrialization. Now, what we're talking about in terms of industrialization are things like factories, mass production, wage labor, management positions. Basically, the workplace is changing completely. Instead of people working on farms or in individualized shops like blacksmiths or carpenters who are making their own products, we have factories that are now using machines and unskilled labor to produce all of these things. And so it's going to change how we view work. In fact, before industrialization, we didn't even have the phrase go to work because people worked at home. That's going to come about here with the advent of the factories. Now, as factories continue to grow and production increases and booms so that we're just producing more than we can really handle, we start to get something called a trust or a monopoly. Really, these words are, for our purposes, interchangeable. They're a collection of companies controlled by one man. So what happens is, like in Monopoly, the game Monopoly, if you've never played that, when you own all three of the little spots that you get to put your hotels on, then you monopolize that area. It's the same kind of thing with industry. If you're in the oil industry and you own all of the oil refineries, you buy all of them and you consolidate them into one big oil company, you control everything about that oil industry. And that's what a monopoly is. And it's going to become very detrimental to the average worker. It's great for the person who's in control because he is making a ton of money by monopolizing one of these industries. But it means that he gets to say how much oil costs, he gets to say how much his workers get paid, he gets to determine their hours, he gets to determine everything, basically, about the oil industry because there is no oil industry outside of him. And I'm using that specific example because of a man that we'll talk about, Rockefeller, who controls the oil industry and becomes incredibly wealthy. These men who control these philosophies were often referred to as business tycoons. We will refer to them as that as we go through this content. Now, for the business tycoon, this is fantastic. He's going to make all kinds of money. He's going to have all kinds of control. He's going to have a lot of people working for him. It's a good life for him. That's the gilded part, where it looks like, man, all of these industries are producing so much and it's so great and there's so much wealth. But the factory worker is going to have a very different experience of the industrialization process. For instance, the factory worker is now going to be on wage work. This is a very difficult adjustment for workers, because most workers prior to industrialization determined how much money they made themselves, either by how much they worked on their farm or what their prices were in their shop. They were independent. They worked for themselves. Now they're going to be earning an hourly wage that was very, 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 very small, and it was dependent upon how many hours they could get scheduled. And that's going to be a very different way of life for people. It's really going to inhibit the feeling of independence. People they're not in charge of their own finances anymore. They're at the mercy of a management position. And they're at the mercy of the tycoons who get to make all of these rules. This is described very well in The Jungle, which was a book written by Upton Sinclair. And it's technically a work of fiction, but it's actually based on his experiences in the meatpacking industry. He was a journalist, and he decided to go and work in the meatpacking industry for a while to really get a first-hand account of what it was like to be in this situation. And then he wrote a book about it, and that book was responsible for really enlightening other people, non-factory workers, to just how terrible the conditions were. It talked about how people would fall into machines, people would get injured on the job, people were working 16-hour days, they were getting paid just a few cents an hour, they weren't making a living wage. It exposed all of that to the general public. Now, a lot of times when people are in a situation that isn't working for them, like these factory workers were, excuse me, they will turn toward the government and ask the government for help in this, regulate something or provide better opportunity or something to help ease the suffering of the factory workers who were completely under the thumb of the business tycoons. But factory workers couldn't rely on the government at this time, because one of the things that was common in the Gilded Age was this laissez-faire kind of idea. And laissez-faire ideology said that the government should not regulate business. It's this idea of true capitalism, right? That if the economy is healthy, then it will regulate itself, right? And if the government stays out of it, then it will just progress naturally. And that is sort of the core of what capitalism is. And so laissez-faire means hands off. It's a government or a political philosophy that says the government should stay out of the economy. And so they weren't doing anything to regulate these business tycoons who were developing so much power, because the idea was that these business tycoons should regulate themselves, and the harder you work and the more money you make, the more power you have. And so there was really nothing that could come in to help balance the scales in terms of workers versus business tycoons. And so that was one of the philosophies that sort of kept this industrialization system working the way that it did. Another was the concept of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is based on Darwinian principles that you're familiar with, evolution, basically, survival of the fittest, but it was applied socially. So when we apply Darwinian principles socially, basically what we're saying is that those who are meant to survive in society will, and those who are not meant to survive won't. And we shouldn't feel obligated to do anything to help those who are not surviving on their own to better survive. If we want to put it more technically, more formally, then we would say it is the duty of the individual to survive in society, not society's job to make sure that individuals survive. So if somebody was struggling, like a factory worker, couldn't make ends meet, couldn't pay their bills, couldn't find a job, couldn't do any number of things, then society's mindset at the time was very much that, well, they obviously weren't meant to survive. They weren't working hard enough. They weren't doing the right things, because if they were, then they would be more successful. They were meant to survive. they would. And it was better to let people who couldn't survive on their own die out to create a stronger social society of those who fought to survive. And so when we combine laissez-faire and social Darwinism, we have a situation in which for a long time nobody was really willing to accept the fact that something needed to change about the way that industrialization was taking place in order to balance the scales more in favor, or at least more so in favor of the factory worker. Now, a lot of the people who were experiencing the very worst part of factory work was immigrants. During the Gilded Age, nearly 1 million immigrants per year were flooding into the United States. And a lot of these immigrants came from places like Southern and Eastern Europe, like Italy, Greece, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and they were considered in general to be undesirable. They came with the stigma of communism and Catholicism, which are two very bad words in America at this time. They were considered dangerous, as though they were going to try to make the United States communist, which was the worst thing that the United States could be, according to a lot of people during the Gilded Age. In addition to these two stigmas, which will be very important as we continue our discussion to remember that we associate immigrants with communism and Catholicism, in addition to that, they were also perceived as less educated and less skilled. That part was more accurate. People coming over from these Southern and Eastern European countries were coming over because they needed greater opportunity, they needed to try to find something better than what was available to them at home, and they didn't come with a lot of background in education or skilled work. And so it was natural for them to take these factory jobs. But the impact of this is that these immigrants become associated with labor. So labor refers to people who are working, the workforce, essentially. That's labor. And we associate labor with immigrants, which means when the labor movement begins and factory workers start to try to fight for their rights, most of those people are going to be immigrants. Most of them are going to be associated with communism, and that's going to really damage the cause that the factory workers have in terms of trying to secure better rights for themselves. But nonetheless, the labor movement does begin in the 1880s, really. It kicks off. And this is workers fighting back against the power and the monopolies that these tycoons have over them. They form unions, and those unions engage in tactics like strikes. And that strike is where everybody in a certain industry or a certain factory or a certain department will put down their machinery, step back, stop working, and walk out. And that slows down production. That keeps business tycoons from making money, which is what business tycoons do. And so it was usually a very effective way of protesting, as long as there weren't strike breakers who would come in and take those jobs that the labor unions had abandoned. So it becomes sort of in the 1880s, 1890s, we see a lot of conflict between these workers and the business tycoons, people running the businesses. There was a lot of conflict. Often the police and the government would side on the businesses side and try to enforce the workers that they would go and do their jobs. So it could get a little bit dangerous sometimes. And one example of an event in which it gets quite dangerous is an event for the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor was one of the biggest unions and the most inclusive. They weren't industry specific, like it wasn't the oil workers union or the railway workers union. It was anybody who was a factory worker or in the lower class, somebody like that could be part of the Knights of Labor. They didn't even segregate based on race, and that was incredibly unique for this particular time. They began in the 1880s, and one of their causes that they championed is something called the 888 plan. And that meant 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, 8 hours for what you will. Basically, they were arguing that people should be reducing the 14 to 15-hour workday to an 8-hour workday, which was going to be a huge change for a lot of businesses. But they were arguing that this was the only way to promote democratic society, because if people were working 15, 16, 17 hours a day, 6 days a week, what time did they have left over to participate in their community, to volunteer, to educate themselves, to vote to participate in politics in any way. There was no time left over for that. And so they said that if we wanted to continue a democratic society, we had to balance our work and leisure hours so that people could have the opportunity to participate in some of these other events. Now, the Knights of Labor went around and they did a lot of protesting and striking and awareness raising about this issue. And in Chicago in 1886, they were holding a rally. And during this rally, a bomb went off. And it killed several officers who were on scene patrolling. And there were 8 immigrants who were standing up on a platform. You can see that this is a picture of it here. They're standing up on this platform and they're giving a speech about the Knights of Labor cause. And you can see here that a bomb has just gone off. And these 8 immigrants were blamed for that bomb going off. And 5 of them were convicted of anarchy, meaning that people thought they were trying to overthrow the government because of that connection to communism. And this is basically going to end the Knights of Labor here in 1886, and it's really going to set the labor movement back for several decades, this one Haymarket Affair event. And you can read more about that in your book. I want to move on here to the Progressive Era, which is basically where we say, you know what, we've got to start doing something about this. For about 25 years, from 1877 to 1900, we have this intense conflict between the factory workers and the business tycoons. There's so much inequality, there's so much suffering, there's so much domination by the business tycoon, and the government really isn't doing anything about it. And so it's not going to be until middle-class white people form the progressive movement that we're really going to start to see a change in our industry. So take note of your IDs again, we've got those here. And so who were these progressives that began to identify that there was a problem? Well, they were white, they were middle class, and predominantly they were women. And you can see here in this picture that's in the background, this is a picture of a progressive club or movement in a particular area. These were women who were attempting to clean up society as they saw it. They did a lot of work in these immigrant areas. Immigrants would move into very poor neighborhoods and work in factories, and they had very low quality of life. And a lot of these women would be in these areas trying to clean up. And some people ask, well, what was their motivation? Was it really to genuinely help people, or were they tired of the dirt and the muck in their society that was created by these poor areas that were only growing all the time? And so you can read the sources for yourself and sort of determine what you think their motivation was. And probably there were some who were motivated by genuine care for these people, and some who were motivated by this desire to sort of tidy up society. I'm not going to go through these goals individually with you because I think they're pretty self-explanatory, and I don't want this lecture to run too long. But look at these goals and kind of get the gist of what these people were doing. They wanted the government to take a more active role. They wanted to reduce the power of monopolies. They wanted taxes for services. They wanted shorter work days. They wanted to ban child labor. Often children as young as 7 or 8 were working in factories. And they wanted to reduce the hours worked by women and generally create cleanliness and order in society. That's just a brief overview. Your book will give you more information about those things, but that gives you an idea of sort of what the purpose was for these women. There are a number of events that served during the Progressive Era from 1900 to 1920 that served to raise awareness about how important it is for something to be done in these factory areas. One example is the Triangle Fire that happened on March 25th of 1911. Many women, over 100 women died in a triangle fire because their building was not up to regulation, and it caught fire and began to burn, and they were on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floor of this building, and the business tycoons had locked the doors from the inside to keep women from taking too many breaks as they worked in this textile factory. And the fire escape wasn't up to code, and the elevators weren't up to code, and none of it was working properly because there was no regulation, and women ended up having to jump from the windows to their death to avoid being burned alive. And this story is going to get all of the newspapers. It's going to become a rallying cry for why change needs to happen in the workplace. So these big kind of events obviously were catalysts for change, but we also had people called muckrakers, who were journalists and photographers who would go into factories and they would expose the dangers of the workplace. For instance, Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle, was such a muckraker who exposed the dangers of the workplace. These two photographs here are examples of photographer muckrakers who would print pictures of children in these terrible work conditions in order to generate sympathy for the progressive cause. And a lot of the efforts by these muckrakers led to the beginnings of reform, where the government does step in and say, you know what, we do need to make sure that there are some standards in place here for industrialization. And so we get things like the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, both of those in 1906. Another important part of progressivism is the development of Fordism. This refers to how Henry Ford, who was an Irish immigrant, ran his factories. He created automobiles. And what he did is he focused on standardization. He made it so that it was a lot cheaper and easier to make cars by standardizing all of the parts for them, which may seem obvious to you, but prior to the Model T that he created, cars were made individually by one person, and they could all be a little bit different. But he standardizes these cars, and he's able to produce them at a much lower price. The assembly line is going to further help with that because he's going to create the process of having this long assembly line with one person doing one specific job, just a row of people each doing their individual jobs. And so he's able to hire more people, and he's able to produce his cars more quickly. So he's making a lot of money. What really makes him progressive is that in 1914, he voluntarily raised the wages of his workers. And he's really the first person to realize that the way to make money is not to scrape every penny together and not give your workers a living wage, but it was to actually give workers more money because now they wanted to work for him. They were loyal to him. They did a good job working for him because he was paying them so much more than anybody else would. And they were able to buy his cars. He wanted workers to have enough money to save that they could buy his cars so that his market didn't run out. Because pretty soon everybody who could afford a car was going to have one. And so he needed to create more people who could afford to buy cars. So Henry Ford was a very good businessman and a progressive. Other examples of progressive mentality are found in women like Jane Addams, who founds the Hull House in 1889. Jane Addams was a very unique woman because she was highly educated and she actually won the Nobel Peace Prize for a lot of her efforts, which was unusual for a woman during her time. She would definitely be one of the progressives that was genuinely motivated by a desire to help people who were suffering. And she devoted her life to that. The Hull House began in Chicago, and it was a place that worked to raise money to build kindergartens and playgrounds and health clinics and unemployment agencies. And it also provided a safe haven to victims of domestic abuse or people who needed to come and get food or people who needed to drop their kids off for childcare while they went to work. She provided a lot of services to immigrant women in particular, and even provided birth control, which was very controversial at the time. She thought it was important for people to have birth control because women were having so many children and they couldn't take care of them. And so she thought that it was a woman's right to be able to decide whether or not she wanted to produce children. So she was very advanced for this time period. During the Progressive Era, we also have presidents who take a more active role in the presidency. They sort of abandon this laissez-faire idea, and they consider themselves to be the mediators between businesses and workers. We have three of them: Teddy Roosevelt, William Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, who were president from 1901 through 1920 collectively. And each one of them took steps to try to balance the scales between the workers and the industry leaders. And you can read more about their individual efforts about that in the book. That will be important for you to review. We're going to end our Progressive Era discussion by talking about what women were doing during the Progressive Era. Women are going to be a huge component of the progressive movement, and a lot of it is about cleaning up society and taking care of immigrants, but a lot of it is also about women's rights. There has been a long history by this point of women fighting for the right to vote ever since the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention. And the traditional form of women's activism has been very subdued up until the Progressive Era. It's been a lot of petitions, a lot of private speeches, trying to get Western states, as they're admitted to the Union, trying to get them to grant women the right to vote in those states. But it's been a very quiet movement. That will change during the Progressive Era. And it will change because of the National Women's Party created by a woman pictured here named Alice Paul. Now, you're going to watch a movie after you're done with this lecture. It's a movie called Iron Jaw Angels, and it's posted in Module 1. And it's very important that you watch this movie to get the context of the Progressive Era, of the women's movement, and even to introduce the final chapter in this module, which is World War I. It will give you a real taste of what this time period was like. And Alice Paul is a fascinating figure. Every student that I have ever shown this movie to has really, really enjoyed it. And it's very useful. So I encourage you to watch that movie. It's available on YouTube. Again, I have it posted. And it's going to give you an idea of the women's movement and what that was like. And when you've watched that movie, I want you to come back to the PowerPoint here and go over this last slide, which talks about how women get the right to vote. And you can see, based on that movie, you can understand how we get to this point, how we go from Woodrow Wilson, who at first doesn't support women's right to vote, to 1920 or 1919, when he is in support of the women's right to vote. So I'm going to let that movie explain a lot of that process to you, and then review that material in the book once you have watched that movie. All right, so that's a lot of information to cover in one lecture, a very important time period here, and it's important to understand the connection between the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. Basically, the Progressive Era is an attempt to provide solutions for the problems created during the Gilded Age and the rapid increase of industrialization. Okay, so review this material, watch that movie, and do reading in the book, and when you're ready, we'll move on to World